Hey guys, what's going on? It's Ash here coming at you today in Clash Royale, this time with returning guest Woody. You guys loved Woody when he was on the first time, talking about the best and the worst cards in the current meta, and then we kind of speculate on what does and doesn't need buffs or nerfs, and then we discuss maybe how or what these cards should get in terms of buffs and nerfs. So a lot to get to, excuse me, today. Before I do so, I do want to ask you guys, do you want this to be an every other week series where I bring Woody on, or would you rather have it like once a month? I want to know how often you want me to do this. Like I said, he does post every other week. So in the background, guys, by the way, enjoy some tournament gameplay. Started out here by Brian RT, who is actually one of the final 16 in the entire CR North American Open. So that was really cool. He's going to kick things off with his cool Lava Hound clone deck. So guys, make sure you pay attention to the gameplay too. It should be pretty good from a recent Brenchong CWA tournament. And without further ado, let's bring in the man of the hour, Mr. Woody. Alright guys, here I am joined by the Sultan of Stats himself, none other than Woody. Woody, how you doing, man?
Doing great. Thanks so much for having me back. Had a blast time and look forward to our next conversation.
As do I, my friend. It was actually really great. The last conversation went over really well. People loved hearing you talk about what's popular, what's not popular, and give kind of a background on these cards and maybe some suggestions on how they can up their game. So before we start, why don't you tell us a little bit about what this snapshot is that you do and what it does and maybe does not mean?
Certainly. So I've always been really interested in deck building and trying to figure out the best way to dominate the metagame. And so many months ago, I started doing these card popularity snapshots. I recently released my 18th one. And the goal of them is to find the cards that are being used the most by the top 100 players in the game. So at the conclusion of each season in the game, I look at all the decks being used at the top and record all the cards that are being used, which ones are being used with each other, which win conditions are most popular, which versatile cards are most popular. And I'll exclude any decks that are kind of troll decks, if you will, if they just have legendary cards or they're only buildings or only spells or something like that. But the overall goal is to find which cards are being used the most by the players who are having the most success with them. And at the top of the ladder, most players have unlocked every card and have leveled them up to a pretty decent level. So you're at a relatively even playing field. And it's useful if you want to know which cards do well on ladder to take a look at the top of that list. Not necessarily all of the cards at the top of the list are like win condition cards. Most of the ones at the very, very top are ones that work in a lot of different decks very well. But as you continue to go on down the list, you'll see we move on from very generic, versatile cards like Zap and the Log onto win condition cards. This snapshot, we see cards like Graveyard, Giant, and Miner doing very well as the offensive cards.
Yeah, and before we actually get into the individual cards, would you recommend, in terms of usage of this snapshot, would you recommend folks out there kind of, maybe they're struggling with their certain deck, or they play within a given archetype? I'm envisioning them going on to the Reddit post and kind of thinking about maybe making some substitutions based on what cards are actually doing well in the meta. Is that pretty much how you envision this to be used as well, aside from the win conditions?
Certainly. So if you're building your own deck or you have a favorite kind of deck archetype but have a couple of open slots and you're not sure what to put in there, this is one of the most useful things for you out there. I think the Mega Minion tops the list this time, and we can get into all the different cards.
Again.
But that is just a card that does really well in every single deck archetype. It has really good stats, and the fact that a lot of people are using it and having success with it, I think is testament to the fact that if you're looking for a card out there, starting at the top of the list is a good place to go.
Yeah, well, why don't we just start there? I have a few different things we're going to do in today's video, so stay tuned. We're going to do some rapid-fire nerf buff hold, where we ask Woody what he would do with any cards that are, maybe a little bit unpopular right now or in the middle range. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the clone spell and how that could change the game. But before, we're now getting to the actual list here. You said it. At the top of the list, the Mega Minion. Again, despite the basically 15% overall DPS nerf. Do you think that was enough?
I don't think it was enough. I really do like seeing troops performing well relative to spells. And I think that it kind of lends toward the offense over defense theme that Supercell is going for. But the fact that we have a card that's used in 84% of decks at the top of the ladder really speaks to me, saying that there's something about this card that makes it so good that people have to play it. There's not really a very good counter for it since spells are quite ineffective against the Mega Minion, and there's not very many defensive troops that you can use against it, especially because it's somewhat of a ranged troop. It's kind of on the back line. It does a lot of damage both to single targets and also to swarms. If you play minions against a Mega Minion, you're going to have a bad time.
Yeah.
If you play archers right on top of a Mega Minion, you're going to have a bad time. But if you get a little bit of a distance, that's kind of the one troop that can counter. And I think that's one of the big reasons, in addition to the fact that archers counter Graveyard, archers also do well against Mega Minion, and so they've been doing really well recently as well.
Archers totally surged the last few months from, worst to first, or at least close to. Now, about Mega Minion, do you think that maybe the best route would have been to give it an HP nerf instead of the damage nerf so that a fireball could just hard counter it, or do you think that's going too far?
I think that would probably go a little bit too far. The soul of the card is really trying to create this big single flying unit that can dish out either damage to swarms or to big bodies, and it is immune to spells. And I think that you just need to scale back its stats even further. I think the devs were on to the right track there, reducing its DPS, and we've just seen that it's still extremely effective against swarms and against big bodies. You can play it proactively in the back of your base. It's kind of a fire and forget, because if your opponent doesn't respond to it, it's going to get 2 swipes on their tower and deal a lot of damage. So I don't really want to change, I guess, the fundamental mechanics of the card. If I were a developer, I think I would want to just kind of continue along the same path, reducing it in the ways that make it too powerful.
Yeah, that does make sense. I don't know. It's weird. I have a love-hate relationship with Mega Minion. I shouldn't say I love-hate. I love the card. I think it's an awesome card, and I play it in all my decks as well. So, one part of you says, I don't want it to be nerfed anymore. I like that it's a dominant card in the game, not only the meta, but just, some cards just have overall utility no matter what the meta is. And it would be nice if that was that kind of a role in the game, but you're right. I mean, the fact that it is in every deck obviously also boxes out other cards from seeing gameplay. So that is an issue, I think. But at the same time, I love it. So I don't know. I do not envy the game designers and the developers who have to make these tough decisions, especially on the popular cards, because you want a card to do well, especially when you release it.
Absolutely. And so the only deck archetype that we saw not playing a Mega Minion was a Miner Zap Bait deck that chose Minion Horde instead, just because you can get the same sort of swarm effect out of a flying card, but get a lot more DPS packed into that one card slot. But for pretty much every other case, if you want a flying troop, and most decks do, you want to stick the Mega Minion in there.
Yeah, do you think the right method might be giving small buffs to a large series of other classes of cards to kind of put them on the same level, or do you just go back to your original answer and just continuing to nerf the Mega Minion just slightly?
I think that there certainly are a lot of cards out there that compete with the Mega Minion that could be deserving of a buff, but I am afraid in terms of overall power creep, just the inexorable march toward making cards stronger, that buffing a large swath of them wouldn't necessarily be as good as just dialing back this one card that sees really high use rate.
Yeah, I agree. So let's move on from Mega Minion. Let's talk about Graveyard, because Graveyard not only is dominating tournament play, but it's also starting to appear more and more on the ladder. And, I'd assume because people are actually discovering and leveling it up now. And, a lot of the top 100 players even have it maxed out now. So what do you think about Graveyard? Does it need to be nerfed as well?
Graveyard is the new hotness. It is the most popular pure offensive card in the game right now. It rose 18 points in usage from 7 in the last snapshot to 25. So a quarter of all decks use Graveyard as the win condition. I think that it's a little bit too early to say whether or not it needs a buff for sure. There are cards that do pretty well to counter against it. And I think one of the big pain points right now is that losing to Graveyard is very frustrating. It's one of the same reasons why when Mortar was really strong and Expo were really strong, they got nerfed. It's because losing to them is really frustrating because you don't really know what you're supposed to do to get back against a Graveyard, especially when Graveyard is comboed with Freeze or Fireball to shut down any defensive troops. It makes for a very daunting push, and one that puts defenders in a do-or-die sort of situation to get the skeletons dead or die trying.
Yeah, I was definitely going to mention that about freeze, too. It's funny when you see, like, his Graveyard, as you said, is the #1 win condition in the game right now. And, like you said, a quarter of all decks, that's insane. And freeze took a huge surge in popularity. And freeze, you know, it's funny when you see the win condition dominating the meta, all these other cards take the rise with it. And once people started to learn how to counter Graveyard, you know, either using their Ice Golem, their Archers, whatever they were going to counter it with, you start seeing these additional spells basically being added to the meta and taking the surge as well. And freeze is one of them. So freeze, along with, I'm starting to see a few more just Hog Rider freeze decks, even though the Hog Rider, I think it took a little bit of a dip in popularity, but it's still pretty popular up there as a win condition card. So can you talk a little bit about, you know, how these spells vary depending on what the win condition of the deck that people are playing are?
I think that's a brilliant observation, and it really speaks to the core of the metagame. Are we playing really big, beefy troops like the Golem, Baby Dragon, Lightning combinations, the Lava Hound Lightning Arrow combinations that we saw recently, or are we playing much more chip-based oriented decks that utilize things like the Log and maybe even Poison in the past was very popular in a lot of different deck archetypes. The fact now that Graveyard is one of the most popular win conditions, that it's also a spell, and that it combos well with two other spells, either the Freeze or Fireball. Yeah. I think that is really kind of indicative of the direction of the game. We see a decrease in popularity for cards like Musketeer and other glass cannons. Yeah, that are essentially lightning bait. Exactly.
Yeah.
So as fewer people are playing those sorts of really strong spells, we see like Lightning, for instance, dipped down to 25. It's now tied with Graveyard for usage. I think that we will start to see some of those decks that can take advantage of an opponent not having Lightning coming back into the metagame.
Yeah, so you said, I was surprised that you said you agree that it's very powerful, but you're not sure about a nerf. Why is that?
Well, it's relatively new. I recall at the beginning of the game, it was very difficult to counter a Goblin Barrel because players didn't really know what to do against it. It became apparent quite soon that you can either zap it for a positive elixir trade or just throw arrows on it, or when the log came out, you could throw the log on it too. But whenever someone discovers a new way to take advantage of game mechanics, I think that they ought to be able to reap the rewards of being at the cutting edge of that metagame. And I'm not yet sure if there doesn't exist a counter to Graveyard. I think that if we see Graveyard really dominant for another couple of weeks, that it should get attention from the Supercell developer team in terms of balancing. But right now, I'm not absolutely convinced that it is purely dominant, or if we just haven't found the right way of setting, our archers or our minions to counter the Graveyard, or, counter pushing the opposite lane to ensure that your opponent can't build up into that 16 elixir push. So.
Yeah. You're a really smart guy, and that's, that's something that a lot of people don't have is patience, especially in these mobile games. It seems like people immediately want a nerf or a buff immediately on a certain card. But, I guess I respectfully not disagree, because I think we're kind of in the same boat here, but just based on these tournaments that I'm running, every single day, it seems like literally, and I wish this was an exaggeration, but it's not, but 7 out of 10 of the top 10 in 1K tournaments are running Graveyard. And I know this breakdown is for ladder play, but it just tells me that, wow, I mean, that is a big ratio for a win condition card. It's not like it's a Mega Minion support card. That's huge, So, I think that maybe, I wouldn't be surprised, I guess, if next round of balancing we see a nerf to Graveyard. I'd be pretty surprised if we didn't, actually. But kind of moving on past Graveyard, though, I have a theory that I wanted to run by you. We talked a little bit about this off mic, and it's interesting because you kind of brought up a counterpoint that I wanted to share with everybody else. And my theory is that when Supercell releases cards for Clash Royale, I think the game designer purposely makes them a little bit underwhelming, and I would cite, Elite Barbarians and Tornado, with a huge exception of Graveyard. And I think the thought process there is they don't want people to level up these cards, get these cards, and then immediately have them nerfed and kind of feel deflated. But you kind of brought up a different point, and I thought that was kind of smart as well. Can you kind of talk to that that whole theory that I have?
Sure. There's a lot of different ways to approach the introduction of new content in the game, and wanting to make cards, kind of balanced right as soon as they come out is the ultimate goal. But if you want to err on the side of making them a little bit stronger or weaker, you have a few different tools at your disposal if you're someone like Supercell, because you can, after the fact, go in and change it. So we see buffs and nerfs all the time to new cards. You cited Elite Barbarians and Tornado as an example of two cards that are relatively underwhelming, and why they do have a pretty low usage rate right now. And I think that Elite Barbarians in particular are underpowered. I can obviously offer a counterexample, not just in the graveyard that you mentioned, but also in the Mega Minion, which does really well right now on the ladder, and it's one of these relatively new cards.
I would bring back Bowler 2 was very underwhelming, when I'm just kind of spitballing here, but you don't think that most cards are kind of Inferno Dragon, what else?
I agree with you that in general, I think that most of the cards, when they become introduced, have been a little bit underwhelming, but you can't just compare them to the most used cards in the game right now. I mean, if you want to compare Inferno Dragon to something like Sparky, or to something like Wizard, which has been in the game since day one, or Giant Skeleton, which has been in the game since day one, those cards are also pretty low on the totem pole. There's a high threshold to get that really, elite card that everyone is willing to use in their deck. And so it just kind of is a grab bag mixture of, trying to get a card in the right spot that people want to play it, but not making it too powerful that it must be played in a deck.
Yeah, that does make sense. So you think that they try to, well, obviously they're trying to get a perfect balance, but you're saying that beyond that, you think that they actually might try to make it, maybe a little bit more powerful so people will actually want to play it?
Yeah, if a new card comes out and it's not good at all, it's kind of underwhelming. People get disappointed. They, either spend gems or take a lot of time out of their day to grind these grand challenges to get the new cards, and then they realize that they're not very effective. It's not fun. So making cards powerful right off the bat, I think there's something to be said for that, and then scaling them back a little bit if you find that they're too powerful.
Yeah, speaking of powerful or not powerful, let's talk briefly about Clone Spell. Have you seen or played it all? I know you have access to the developer build. Have you tried it out?
I have tried it out. I actually wound up playing the Clone Spell a lot when I was in Helsinki. It's a lot of fun because it works with a pretty decent variety of decks. I think it works the best in Zap Bait decks, where you're trying to force your opponent off of their typical cycle of cards on defense by just kind of throwing a huge number of cards at them, or a huge number of troops at them. And basically with Clone Spell, you can double any number of troops that you're using. So it's going to work really well with things like Skeleton Army. It's going to work well with Goblin Barrel, I think, with Minion Horde. But it actually also will work well with a couple of other cards that don't typically fit into a Zap Bait deck. I think it's actually going to do quite well with Lava Hound and with Giant Skeleton. If the death damage and the units that spawn on death are consistent with the clones across the normal troops, then there's potential to just make a big surprise factor using the Clone Spell when your Lava Hound or Giant Skeleton, or maybe even Golems, since they spawn Golemites, reach the tower.
Yeah, I actually really agree with you. I'm in the camp that Clone Spell might be I don't know, game changer is probably too extreme, but I think it will actually be widely used, especially among skilled players. Like, I think Clone's going to be a skill card. And the reason I say that is basically for the things that you just touched on, the reasons you just touched on, and that is the Zap Bait potential it has. I mean, you can make somebody pay with a Clone Spell. I mean, the people who are lukewarm on the card seem to be saying, based on the leaked footage out there right now, a lot of people seem to be citing, but you can kill the cloned unit with one Zap Spell, who cares? They have like 1 HP. But I think that you really nailed it. This is a skill card that people are going to have to really play in it, at the right time, basically. They're going to have to outcycle their opponent with it, and it's a great bait card. So I agree with you. I think that Clone might be one of the better cards that's been released recently. And speaking of the cards that have been released recently, what do you think about Tornado?
Tornado is so underappreciated. I think that we haven't really gotten to the point where it's useful because people haven't really discovered the niche cases that make it useful. But I've seen videos from Pong TV, for instance. There's another post on Reddit recently that showed me, I think it might have even been done by Yarn from OJ, that you can pull a Hog Rider from an arena tower onto the King Tower to activate it.
Yeah,
and
we
for
had
3 elixir, that is just such a huge benefit to be able to activate your King Tower right at the beginning of a match.
That's amazing, and I don't understand why we're not seeing more of that right now in actual game. Like I've rarely seen it in game, but I did host a tournament where, you know, like a pros play tournament, and I recorded probably about like a dozen matches of people using the Tornado, and it's funny because I saw it several times. I think Marcel P finished 4th or 5th in the 1K tournament, and he did it twice in the tournament where he pulled the Hog Rider. A Hog Rider once and a Goblin from a Goblin Barrel in the other example. And I think that just activating that King Tower is pretty big, you know?
Absolutely. And so as more people experiment with the card, I think that it might be one of these sleeper picks where it's not doing too well right now, but even if it doesn't benefit from a round of buffs, and I think it might get buffed, but even if it doesn't, that people are going to discover sneaky ways of using it. And if Clone Spell becomes really popular, of course, Tornado definitely benefits since it'll one-shot any of the cloned troops.
Absolutely. A really nice hard counter to clone. Do you think that the way to buff that card would be to increase the range rather than the DPS? Or the duration?
I certainly think it would be. You could change the duration, but the core of the card is the ability to pull troops that your opponent has played into another spot. And you get more versatility in terms of where you can place that Tornado spell, the bigger the radius is. And I think paying 3 elixir to change your opponent's lane of attack is a pretty interesting mechanic, and I'd like to see it see more use on ladder.
Yeah, I agree. I think that just even like a half tile improvement on range, it doesn't have to be dramatic. I think that would make a big difference. As you said, it would make it easier to switch lanes on your opponent, and it would make it easier to activate your King Tower with whatever win condition you're trying to pull over in that direction. So let's move on to the last segment. It's going to be the rapid fire nerf, buff, or hold. Woody, are you ready?
I'm ready, Clash with Ash.
All right, man. So P.E.K.K.A.
P.E.K.K.A. needs a buff. For sure.
How do you buff
It takes way
P.E.K.K.A.
too long to get it on the field, and it gets distracted way too easily. I think that if you reduce the deploy time, if you reduce its sight range, or if you increase its hit points, any of those 3 or a combination perhaps thereof, or maybe even reducing its cost to 6, those are all things that I would consider as a way to buff P.E.K.K.A.
Sparky.
Buff Sparky for sure. Sparky completely unused at the top of the ladder, mostly because once you figure out how to beat it, there's nothing that you really have to do about it. It does do really well in the middle arenas, arena 5, 6, 7, but I think the fact that you can reset it so easily with Zap and with Freeze and with Ice Spirit makes it very difficult to use at the top.
Yeah, with so much log, I mean, it seems like every card that gains popularity, it counters poor Sparky, you know? Like, it used to be lightning, now it can reset, and then it was, so much log play just made it easier to push it back and counter. Mega Minions in every single deck, and Mega Minions a good counter. But anyway, Dark Prince.
Dark Prince needs a buff. I think that they ought to give the Prince and the Dark Prince that charge time that they lost. I think it was either in February or March, way early in the game, but Prince used to be super powerful. And I think that if Dark Prince kind of rejoined him as a key offensive unit by giving him a better opportunity to hit enemy towers and destroy all these swarms of enemy troops being used, that would be great. As it stands right now, Valkyrie is just pretty much strictly better than a Dark Prince. The shield is an interesting mechanic, but you got to be able to kill something with him too.
Yeah, I agree. I think that, to see a buff to Dark Prince and Prince, just imagine how that would, impact the rest of the meta. Like, if people were starting to play Dark Prince and Prince, I mean, it would really open up an entire new landscape, and in other cards that we talked about in the beginning of this video would start seeing more love, the supporting cards. So I think that would be a really huge Pandora's box, so to speak, to open up and see how the game changed. Wizard.
Wizard, I think, also needs a buff. Most of these cards, I'm thinking, need buffs. We saw 0 usage of Wizard this past card popularity snapshot and also 0 the time before, there's just not a whole lot of, swarmy type targets that we have for the wizard to be shooting down. So he's not really good in the current metagame. I think he's also relatively understated. And also the fact that a lightning can kill the wizard outright just means that it's very difficult to use him overall. The ice wizard is relatively competitive with the wizard, and he costs 2 elixir less. So it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense to me to be playing wizard right now. Definitely need a buff one.
Mortar.
Buff it.
How did I know that was going to be the answer?
They call me Woody the Mortar Mauler. I love playing siege decks, and I can tell you that over the past several months, I've been really discouraged from playing Mortar. I think it's extremely difficult to make it work in a deck on ladder right now. I've actually switched to Expo and have been playing different control decks. I actually was playing Bowler Graveyard recently. But whenever I try to find a new Mortar deck, I feel like everything that I play against counters me, and there's no real way to make Mortar work right now. I have seen some people play Mortar Royal Giant combination decks and also even Mortar Expo decks. My Clanbake Turtwig has been playing that one really well recently. But overall, Mortar, super difficult to use, and deploy time decrease is reasonable in a metagame in which Royal Giant is really popular.
Okay, I want to end with the most controversial card in the game right now, the Royal Giant. So, what do you do about Royal Giant? The reason it's not high on your list here is because it's not widely used amongst the top 100 players, but it is incredibly widely used in Legendary Arena as a whole, and below. So, what do you think about Royal Giant, Woody? Are you a fan? If so, or if not, how do you fix it?
I'll add a disclaimer to your preface there. Royal Giant actually was one of the most popular deck archetypes. We saw 13 instances of a Royal Giant Furnace deck at the top of the ladder, but it is even more oppressively strong lower on down throughout Arena 7, 8, 9. And the reason for that is because it's the sole troop that is a win condition as a common card.
Yeah.
So it's very easy to get it over-leveled. You see a lot of level 10 players who are able to get a level 12 Royal Giant, level 11 players who can max out their Royal Giant. And that fact alone means that it just has a lot of hit points and does a lot of damage relative to the other cards that he's competing with as a win condition. And so
I agree with you. Yeah,
I don't even really know what you can do to nerf him because he's relatively balanced under tournament rules. It's just he's insanely strong on ladder because it's super easy to over level him. I really want him to be a card that counters Siege. I think that he should shut down Expo and Mortar decks, and if Expo and Mortar were to become too popular, I would want to see Royal Giant come back. But the fact that he's so reliable as a win condition makes me cringe. I'm really unhappy with that. So I'd like to see, I think, a deploy time increase for the Royal Giant. That would make it a little bit more difficult to just drop him directly on top of the bridge to get some instant chip damage in. It would make it a little bit easier to build up really huge pushes, but you're opening yourself up to attack if you're going to invest 6 elixir on a solely offensive card. And then I think the final component of that is that if you have already taken down one of your opponent's towers, if you drop a Royal Giant directly on their side of the arena to try to get the second tower down, a deploy time increase would give the defender a little bit more of an opportunity to just set something up real quick to defend against the Royal Giant.
That's great ideas. I love the deploy time idea, but I mean the problem is no matter what you do to him, he just feels like he's to me at least, and I could be wrong here, but to me in tournament level standards, he seems perfect. Like I wouldn't touch him at all. So anytime you touch him, no matter what you do to him, any kind of a nerf makes him less valuable in tournament play, and he's at risk of being underpowered. Maybe that's just the trade you have to make in order to kind of curb its usage. But yeah, I mean, it's a tough problem there. I feel like, I don't envy the designer on that one. But I wanted to ask too, I guess the last question, kind of following up on the Royal Giant point is, do you think it's a mistake, if you were a game designer now, do you think it's a mistake to make win condition cards common?
I think it is. And the reason that we just touched on is the fact that it's really easy to over-level your common cards. And so it's not inherently a mistake to make win conditions common, but the fact that commons are really easy to upgrade relative to rares and especially to epics and legendaries is the key mistake there. So if we had greater access to rare cards and to epic cards, it would be fine for commons to be win conditions. But the way that the game economy is balanced right now, you shouldn't have access to a win condition that can be so much more powerful than your opponent's cards that can defend against that.
Agreed. I agree with you, man. I think that, rare is that sweet spot for a win condition in my mind, but we'll have to wait and see what they do. Will they take your advice? Well, time will tell, I guess. But, I've taken up a lot of your time, speaking of time, so just wanted to thank you again for coming on. Why don't you tell folks where they can find you? Your streams, especially, are very entertaining. They get me through my workday. So, let us know where we can find you, man.
Certainly. I really appreciate you bringing me on to your channel one more time. I've enjoyed talking with you every single time, and I hope we can do it again. To answer your question, my name is Woody. I'm the leader of Reddit Alpha, a global top 50 clan, and founding member of Reddit's Royale clan system. You can find me out on the Twitterverse at Woody_CR. And like you mentioned, I stream on Twitch. My username is WWoody123. And I'm also here on YouTube. And my channel here is, I believe it's also WWoody123. I should probably have that memorized by now, but I'm sure we can get the link in there. Yeah, it is WWoody123.
Well, the links, guys, will all be in the description. So, but thanks again, man. Any shout-outs or anything like that, or are you good to go?
I definitely got to give, that shout-out to the Reddit Alpha guys. Hope that everyone in the Reddit Alpha clan family is doing well out there and looking forward to competitive events coming up in the near future.
Such a great leader. Thanks, Woody, so much, man. I appreciate it.
Absolutely, man. Thanks again for having me on.
No problem. Bye-bye. You did it. You did it. You made it all the way till the end, guys. Thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate it, guys. Again, would really like to hear your feedback, because if you're here now with me, it means you are a true fan, or maybe you forgot to turn your computer or your device off. So, guys, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. As always, take care, guys.